June 6, 1987, Eleanor Vance vanished from a luxury hotel suite in Baltimore, Maryland. She was 26 years old, dressed in a silk robe, and just 1 hour away from walking down the aisle on her wedding day. The room was immaculate. Her gown was waiting. Her fiancé was downstairs. But Eleanor was gone. No note, no witnesses, no signs of a struggle. Just an unnerving, perfect silence where a life used to be. For 14 agonizing years, her disappearance remained one of Baltimore's most haunting cold cases. A story that slowly faded into a tragic local legend. The world believed she was a runaway bride, a woman who simply had second thoughts and walked away from it all. They were wrong. 14 years later, a dying man's final confession, delivered in the form of a small wooden box, would lead her former fiancé on a cross-country journey to a truth far more sinister than anyone could have ever imagined. What he discovered would not only solve the mystery of where Eleanor went, but reveal the terrifying reason why she was forced to disappear in the first place. Eleanor, known to everyone as Ellie, was the kind of person who seemed to radiate light. At 26, she was a burgeoning graphic designer with a portfolio that buzzed with the vibrant, bold energy of the late 80s. She wasn't just talented, she was ambitious. Her dream, one she often spoke of with her fiancé, Marcus Thorne, was to open her own design firm in downtown Baltimore. She had already picked out a name, Vance Vanguard. Ellie saw the world in color, in form, in possibility. Her laughter was infectious, a full-bodied sound that could fill a room and make strangers smile. She loved the sharp, complex notes of jazz music, the smell of old books, and the comforting chaos of her parents' Sunday dinners. Her relationship with her mother and father was the bedrock of her life. They were her confidants, her cheerleaders, her safe harbor. They adored Marcus, a thoughtful and driven young architect who seemed to ground Ellie's artistic spirit with his steady, quiet strength. Together they were a perfect composition. They had spent months planning their life, not just the wedding. They had blueprints for a house Marcus was designing, swatches for a nursery, and a shared savings account for the down payment on the future home of Vance Vanguard. The emotional stakes were immeasurably high. This wasn't just a marriage, it was the culmination of two intertwined dreams. Friends described their love as effortless. One recalled a time they got caught in a sudden downpour while walking through the inner harbor. Instead of running for cover, Ellie had grabbed Marcus's hands and started dancing, her head thrown back, laughing as the rain soaked them to the bone. That was Ellie, a woman who found joy in the unexpected, who embraced life with an open heart. She had everything to live for, a future so bright it was almost blinding. But there was a shadow in her life, one she rarely spoke of: her uncle, Jeremiah Vance. Her father's older brother, Jeremiah, was a wealthy, imposing figure who cast a long, cold shadow over the family. He was a man of immense influence and unspoken power, whose affection always felt conditional, possessive. Ellie kept him at a distance, an instinct she couldn't fully explain but trusted implicitly. She had politely declined his offer to pay for the wedding, a decision that had caused a quiet but palpable rift. He was not invited to the ceremony. It was a boundary she had drawn to protect the sanctity of her day, to ensure that the light she and Marcus were building together would not be dimmed by that familiar, oppressive shadow. This small act of defiance, this simple assertion of her own life, would prove to have consequences more devastating than she could ever have foreseen. The life she had so meticulously and joyfully designed was about to be erased. The morning of June 6, 1987, dawned bright and clear, a perfect Chesapeake Bay day. In her suite at the Harborview Grand Hotel, Ellie was a picture of calm excitement. The air was thick with the sweet scent of gardenias, her chosen flower, and the faint mist of hairspray. Her mother, Beatrice, was a steadying presence, her hands gently fastening the tiny pearl buttons on the cuffs of her daughter's silk robe. Her maid of honor, a childhood friend named Lena, bustled around the room, laying out jewelry and making jokes to ease the pre-ceremony jitters. Marcus had sent up a small note that morning, delivered with a single red rose. It read, "I'll be the one waiting at the end of the aisle. I can't wait to start forever. I love you." Ellie had clutched the note to her chest, a wide, genuine smile on her face. The timeline of her final hours was later pieced together with painstaking precision. At 10:15 a.m., the makeup artist finished and packed her kit. At 10:30 a.m., Ellie's mother and father left the suite to greet early arriving family members in the hotel lobby downstairs. At 10:45 a.m., the telephone in the suite rang. Lena answered. It was Uncle Jeremiah. His voice, she would later recall, was unnervingly calm, almost cold. He said he was just calling to wish his niece well, to tell her he hoped she would be happy. He asked to speak to Ellie. Lena passed her the phone. The conversation was short. Those in the room couldn't hear what Jeremiah said, but they saw the shift in Ellie's demeanor. The radiant smile tightened. A flicker of old anxiety crossed her face. When she hung up, she simply said, "He's so strange." She brushed it off, but the light in the room seemed to have dimmed slightly. At 11:15 a.m., the photographer called the suite, saying he was running a few minutes behind schedule. Lena, ever the efficient maid of honor, told Ellie she would run down to the lobby to meet him and escort him up. To save time, she gave her friend a quick hug. "Don't you dare get dressed without me," she said, smiling. "I'll be right back." Ellie was sitting at the vanity, looking at her reflection, a thoughtful expression on her face. That was the last time anyone who knew her saw her. The walk from the suite to the lobby and back should have taken no more than 10 minutes. Lena found the photographer, and together they rode the elevator back up to the 12th floor. The final, seemingly insignificant detail that would haunt investigators for years was noted by a housekeeper in the hallway. As Lena and the photographer walked toward the suite, the housekeeper saw a hotel maintenance worker walking away from that same section of the hall, carrying a small tool bag. He nodded politely and entered a service elevator. It was a detail so mundane, so utterly normal, that it was almost forgotten. When Lena reached the door of Suite 1201 at approximately 11:15 a.m., she found it slightly ajar. Pushing it open, she called out, "We're here. Time for the big reveal." The suite was silent. For a moment, she thought Ellie was hiding, playing a last-minute prank. But the silence stretched, heavy and unnatural. The room was pristine, almost sterile. On the large king-sized bed, the magnificent ivory wedding gown was laid out perfectly. Its lace train fanned out as if for a magazine shoot. Beside it, the satin shoes were placed side by side, heels aligned. On the vanity table, Ellie's jewelry was arranged in a neat little crescent next to her makeup bag. Her purse sat on a nearby armchair, undisturbed. The note from Marcus was still on the nightstand. Everything was exactly where it should be, except for Ellie. Lena checked the bathroom. Empty. The closet. Empty. A knot of confusion began to tighten in her stomach. "Ellie," she called out, her voice now laced with an unfamiliar tremor. "This isn't funny." The photographer stood awkwardly in the doorway, sensing something was wrong. Panic began to bubble beneath Lena's confusion. She raced back to the bed, looking for a note, any sign of where Ellie might have gone. Nothing. Then she saw it. On the wide windowsill overlooking the harbor, there was a single perfect white gardenia. It was not from Ellie's bouquet, which was still in its vase. This one was fresh, dewy, and utterly out of place. It was the only thing in the entire room that felt wrong. Lena sprinted from the room, her heart pounding against her ribs, and found Marcus in the downstairs ballroom greeting guests. The exchange was a blur of frantic whispers. "She's not there." Marcus's smile faded, replaced by a look of utter bewilderment. He followed Lena back upstairs, his confident stride turning into a run. He saw the empty room, the waiting dress, the silent testament to an interrupted life. Disbelief gave way to a cold, creeping dread. He called her parents on a house phone. Their voices, once full of joy, were now sharp with alarm. The hotel security was called. A quick, fruitless search of the immediate floors began. Minutes bled into a half hour, then an hour. The wedding was supposed to start at noon. At 12:30 p.m., with the guests murmuring in confusion and the organist playing the same prelude on a loop, Ellie's father, his face a mask of crumbling composure, made the 911 call. The transcript captured the raw sound of a world breaking apart. "My daughter, she's missing," he stammered, his voice cracking. "Eleanor Vance. We're at the Harborview Grand. It's her wedding day. She's just gone." The arrival of the Baltimore Police Department marked the formal beginning of a nightmare. The initial response was colored by a fatal, almost casual assumption. A beautiful young bride vanishes on her wedding day? The first theory floated by the responding officers, before any real investigation had begun, was the simplest one: cold feet. "It happens more than you think," one detective remarked to Marcus, a comment that felt like a physical blow. "She probably just needed some air, got scared, and took off." This runaway bride narrative took root almost immediately, shaping the entire direction of the initial search. It shifted the focus from a potential abduction to the search for a fickle woman. Precious hours, the most critical in any missing person case, were squandered. Instead of sealing off the hotel as a potential crime scene and canvassing for witnesses to a possible crime, the police conducted a perfunctory search, treating it more like a matter of locating a wayward adult. They questioned Marcus with a thinly veiled suspicion, his grief and panic misinterpreted as potential guilt or complicity in a staged event. The press, catching wind of the story, latched onto the romantic, tragic angle of the jilted groom and the vanished bride. The headline in the next day's paper read, "Harbor Bride Gets Cold Feet, Vanishes at Altar." It was a narrative that was both cruel and deeply damaging. The family's desperate pleas that Ellie would never, ever do this were dismissed as the predictable denials of a shocked family. As days turned into a week, the formal investigation finally broadened, but it was already compromised. They analyzed hotel security footage, which was grainy and incomplete. They found the footage of Lena and the photographer going up in the elevator, but the angle of the hallway camera on the 12th floor was obscured, showing nothing of the doorway to Suite 1201. They did spot the maintenance worker leaving via the service elevator, but the hotel had over a dozen maintenance staff on duty, and with no crime officially declared, there was no reason to single him out. Leads were followed haphazardly. A reported sighting of a woman matching Ellie's description at a bus station turned out to be a dead end. Then, Uncle Jeremiah appeared. He arrived at the police precinct projecting an image of a powerful man shattered by grief. He offered a substantial reward for any information, and more importantly, offered to lend his own private resources to the search. He fed investigators plausible but ultimately false theories. He spoke of a troubled artistic soul, hinting that Ellie might have had a secret life or connections in New York or Philadelphia. He funded private investigators who chased these phantom leads, sending police on wild goose chases that consumed time and resources, pulling their attention further and further away from Baltimore and the truth of what happened in that hotel. The official search became a sprawling, unfocused mess, fatally flawed from its inception by a dismissive narrative and expertly manipulated by the very man responsible for the crime. Within months, the investigation ran out of steam, officially stalling under the weight of its own failures. The case went cold, but the pain remained scalding hot. For Marcus, the years that followed were a waking purgatory. He threw himself into his work, designing soaring, beautiful buildings that felt like a bitter irony, monuments to a future he could no longer build. He kept their shared apartment exactly as it was for 2 years, unable to touch her clothes, her books, the half-finished painting on her easel. Friends and family watched, helpless, as the vibrant, optimistic man they knew was hollowed out, replaced by a quiet, haunted version of himself. He never stopped looking. Every face in a crowd, every woman with a similar laugh, sent a jolt of painful, false hope through him. After 7 years, on the reluctant advice of lawyers and his family, Eleanor Vance was declared legally dead. Marcus was granted a divorce in absentia, a sterile legal proceeding that felt like a second, more profound kind of loss. He was now an ex-husband to a ghost. For Ellie's parents, the passage of time was a cruel thief. The hope that had sustained them in the first year slowly eroded, leaving behind a deep, abiding sorrow that settled into their bones. They aged, the light in their eyes dimming with each passing anniversary of the day their daughter was stolen from them. The story of Ellie Vance seeped into the city's consciousness, becoming a piece of grim Baltimore folklore. She was the vanishing bride of the harbor, a ghost story whispered among hotel staff, a cautionary tale for young lovers. The suite where she disappeared, 1201, developed a morbid reputation. Guests would request it out of a dark curiosity, or avoid it out of superstition. The single, unexplained white gardenia became a central part of the legend, a symbol of the mystery's perfect, maddening neatness. The world moved on, as it always does. The 80s gave way to the 90s, the city changed, and new tragedies occupied the headlines. But for a small circle of people, time stopped on June 6, 1987. The mystery of what happened to Ellie was not a puzzle to be solved. It was an open wound that refused to heal. The lack of answers was a unique form of torture. There was no closure, no grave to visit, just a vast, echoing absence. The feeling of hopelessness became a permanent fixture in their lives. A constant low hum of grief for a woman who was neither alive nor dead, but simply, impossibly, gone. 14 years after Ellie vanished, in the fall of 2001, the phone rang in Marcus Thorne's office. He was now a partner at a prestigious architectural firm, his professional success a stark contrast to his personal desolation. The call was from a law firm. The man on the other end spoke in the measured, dispassionate tones of his profession. "Mr. Thorne," he said, "I'm the executor of the estate of the late Jeremiah Vance. He passed away 2 days ago from a massive coronary. You are named in his will." The name, Jeremiah, sent a cold shock through Marcus. He had not spoken to the man in over a decade. He always harbored a deep, gut-level suspicion of Ellie's uncle, a feeling he could never prove but could never shake. The man's feigned grief, his manipulative control over the search, had always felt wrong. Marcus's first instinct was to refuse, to slam the phone down and sever this last, unwelcome link to that part of his past. He wanted nothing from that man, but a sliver of something, not hope, but a dark, powerful curiosity made him pause. What could Jeremiah possibly have to leave him? He agreed to meet the lawyer. The next day, he sat in a stuffy, wood-paneled office. The lawyer slid a small, heavy wooden box across the polished desk. It was old, intricately carved and locked with a small brass latch. "Mr. Vance was very specific in his instructions," the lawyer explained. "This was to be given only to you, upon his death." Marcus took the box. It felt cold in his hands. The lawyer produced a small key. With trembling fingers, Marcus unlocked the box and lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of faded black velvet, were 2 items. The first was another brass key, this one larger, a standard house key. The second was a single Polaroid photograph. His breath caught in his throat. It was a picture of a woman. Her hair was shorter, threaded with a few strands of gray at the temples. There were lines of weariness around her eyes that he didn't recognize. But it was her. It was Eleanor. She was standing in front of a red brick building, a sign above the door clearly reading, "Redemption Public Library." She wasn't smiling. She looked tired, resigned, a shadow of the vibrant woman he remembered. But she was alive. On the back of the photograph, written in Jeremiah's spidery, arrogant script, were 2 words, "Redemption, Oregon." In that single, stunning moment, the frozen landscape of 14 years of grief and hopelessness shattered. A tidal wave of emotions, shock, rage, and a terrifying, unfamiliar surge of hope crashed over him. The mystery wasn't over. It was just beginning. Marcus Thorne did not call the Baltimore police. They had failed him. They had failed Ellie. They had let the trail go cold while buying into a narrative of a runaway bride, a narrative he now suspected Jeremiah had expertly crafted. This lead was his. The truth was his to uncover. He booked a flight to Portland the next morning, the Polaroid and the key feeling like burning embers in his pocket. From Portland, he rented an anonymous sedan and drove east, deep into the rural heart of Oregon. The town of Redemption was small, isolated, a cluster of buildings nestled in a valley that seemed untouched by the 21st century. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and a stranger would stand out immediately. He found the library from the photograph. It was exactly as it appeared, a stoic brick building on the town's quiet main street. He knew he couldn't just walk in and ask for Eleanor Vance. That name was dead. He had to be careful. For 2 days, he became a ghost. He sat in his car, he walked the town's few streets, he ate at the local diner, just listening. He learned the rhythms of the small town. On the 3rd day, he sat at the counter of the diner and, feigning the air of a lost tourist, slid the Polaroid photo toward the waitress who was refilling his coffee. "Excuse me," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'm looking for a relative I've lost touch with." "Does this woman look familiar to you?" The waitress, a woman in her late 50s with kind eyes, peered at the photo. A flicker of recognition crossed her face. "Oh, sure," she said. "That's Sarah Peterson. Lives out on Mill Road, the little blue house near the old creek. Quiet lady. Comes in for groceries once a week, mostly keeps to herself. Sarah Peterson." The name was a blank slate, but the description was a perfect match for the woman he had seen in the photograph. Mill Road. He paid for his coffee, his hands shaking slightly, and drove. The blue house was set back from the road, surrounded by a simple, slightly overgrown garden. And then he saw her. She was kneeling, tending to a patch of roses, her back to him. The way she moved, the line of her shoulders. It was Ellie. He felt the air leave his lungs. 14 years, a million imagined scenarios, and here was the reality, standing just 50 feet away. He got out of the car, the gravel crunching under his feet. He opened his mouth, and the name that came out was not the one the town knew her by. It was a name from another life. Ellie. Her entire body went rigid. She slowly, stiffly turned around. Her eyes, the same warm brown eyes he had fallen in love with, widened first in confusion, then in dawning, horrifying recognition. It wasn't a look of joy. It was pure, unadulterated terror. She scrambled to her feet and ran for the house, fumbling with the door. He followed, his heart hammering against his chest. "Ellie, wait," he called out. "He's dead. Jeremiah is dead. He can't hurt us anymore." He reached the porch just as she got the door open. He followed her inside, into the dim, stale air of the small house. She had backed into a corner of the living room, her body trembling, her face a mess of tears and disbelief. And there, in that small, dark house, the truth of the last 14 years finally came out. Not in a coherent narrative, but in a torrent of gasps, sobs, and fragmented sentences. She wasn't a runaway. She was a prisoner. The story, pieced together in the aftermath, was a portrait of unimaginable cruelty masked as protection. Jeremiah Vance was more than just a wealthy, domineering uncle. He was a deeply entrenched figure in a Baltimore crime syndicate, a man who operated with a veneer of legitimacy that concealed a core of ruthless criminality. Weeks before the wedding, he had learned through his underworld network that a rival family, one with whom he was engaged in a brutal power struggle, planned to abduct Ellie from her wedding. Their goal was simple and savage: to use her as leverage to force Jeremiah into ceding territory and power. For Jeremiah, this was an intolerable threat on two fronts. He would not be extorted by his rivals, and more importantly, he would not suffer the humiliation of having something, or someone, he considered his taken from him. His sense of ownership over his family, particularly his beautiful independent niece, was absolute. So, in his twisted logic, the only way to protect her from being kidnapped was to kidnap her himself. He orchestrated her disappearance with cold military precision. The maintenance worker seen in the hotel hallway was one of his trusted enforcers. He had used a master key to enter her suite in the brief window she was alone, subdued her quickly and quietly, and escorted her out through the service corridors and into a waiting vehicle in the hotel's loading dock. The single white gardenia left on the windowsill was a final, arrogant flourish, a signature, a private message to himself that he had been there. He flew her on a private plane to Oregon, to a small, isolated property he had owned for years under a shell corporation. There, he laid out the terms of her new life. She would become Sarah Peterson. She would live quietly. She would never, ever attempt to contact Marcus, her parents, or anyone from her past life. If she did, he would have them all killed. He didn't have to shout. He explained it calmly, factually, and Ellie, who had always sensed the darkness in him, knew it was not an idle threat. She knew he had the resources and the ruthlessness to follow through. Her prison had no bars, but its walls were built of pure terror. Twice a year, every year for 14 years, he would visit her. These visits were not social calls. They were reminders. He would update her on her family's well-being, telling her how her parents were aging, how Marcus had tried to move on, reinforcing that their safety depended entirely on her continued silence and obedience. It was a masterpiece of psychological torture, a life sentence served in quiet, isolated desperation. The full, chilling scope of his actions was confirmed after his death, when investigators, prompted by Marcus and Ellie's story, reopened the case and gained access to his private records. His ledgers detailed not only his criminal enterprises, but also the meticulous financial trail of his 14-year conspiracy to keep Eleanor Vance a ghost. The first phone call was the hardest. Marcus sat beside Ellie in the small blue house, his hand resting on her shoulder, as she dialed a number she knew by heart but hadn't touched in 14 years. When her mother, Beatrice, answered, Ellie could only manage a single choked word, "Mom." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening, followed by a sharp intake of breath and a sound that was half sob, half cry of disbelief. The news spread like wildfire through the small, broken circle of people who had never forgotten her. The reunion a few days later, when her parents flew to Oregon, was a moment of impossible, earth-shattering catharsis. They held their daughter, now a 40-year-old woman, and wept for the 26-year-old girl they had lost. It was a miracle wrapped in a tragedy, an overwhelming joy steeped in the profound grief of stolen time. For Ellie, the journey back to herself was just beginning. She had to shed the skin of Sarah Peterson, the quiet, fearful woman who avoided eye contact and lived in the shadows. Relearning how to be Ellie Vance, the woman who danced in the rain and dreamed in bold colors, was a daunting task. The world had moved on. Technology had changed. Her friends had married, had children, built lives. Her parents were visibly older, their bodies bearing the physical toll of a decade and a half of unresolved grief. The reunion with Marcus was the most complex of all. They were no longer the vibrant young couple on the cusp of forever. They were two people irrevocably altered by the same tragedy, but in different ways. He was a man frozen by loss, and she was a woman traumatized by captivity. The love they once had was a memory from another lifetime. They looked at each other and saw both the person they fell in love with and a stranger shaped by years of pain. There was no simple return to the way things were. Their relief was immense, a deep, shuddering exhale after 14 years of holding their breath. But it was inextricably tangled with the sharp, bitter pain of what Jeremiah had stolen from them. Their youth, their shared dreams, the children they never had, the life they were supposed to build together. Their path forward would not be about trying to recapture a perfect past. It would be about learning if they could build something new, something honest and real, from the broken pieces of what was left. The story of Eleanor Vance was rewritten. The myth of the vanishing bride, a tale of romantic fickleness, was replaced by the horrifying truth of a woman held captive by a predator hiding within her own family. Her case, once dismissed and filed away, became a stark and powerful lesson in the insidious nature of coercive control. It forced a difficult conversation, first in Baltimore and then in wider circles, about the forms of abuse that don't leave physical marks but are just as devastating. It highlighted a painful truth, particularly for women of color, whose disappearances are too often met with skepticism or a lack of urgency from law enforcement. Ellie's story was a chilling example of how a narrative, once set, can derail justice for years. While the case itself didn't lead to sweeping changes in law or national policy, its impact was felt on a deeply human level. It changed the way the community and local media talked about missing persons, fostering a greater awareness of the complex realities that can hide behind a seemingly simple disappearance. It served as a grim, unforgettable reminder that the most dangerous monsters are often not strangers lurking in the dark, but people who occupy positions of trust and power, people who claim to love and protect. The true legacy of Ellie's ordeal was not in a new law, but in the power of the truth itself, finally dragged out into the light after 14 years in the dark. It was a testament to the quiet, stubborn endurance of those who loved her, and to the unspoken promise Marcus Thorne had made to himself, to never fully stop wondering, to never fully let her go. That quiet devotion proved to be a force more resilient than any prison Jeremiah Vance could ever build. Eleanor Vance's life was not lost, but stolen by the very person who claimed he was saving it. Her story stands as a harrowing testament to the fact that the deepest betrayals often come from within the walls we call home. If you were moved by the fight for the truth in this case, please show your support by liking this video and sharing it with others who need to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true crime stories that explore the search for justice. We want to know what you think. What part of Jeremiah's 14-year deception shocked you the most? Tell us in the comments below.